Hi, today we're going to look at consciousness, identity, and the self. Know thyself used to be inscribed on Egyptian temples and tombs. And when we go back to Socrates, the notion of knowing thyself is an essential building block of the examined life. So what is the self? For Socrates and Plato, the self was equated with the immortal soul. They had a dualistic reality, two realities, physical reality, part in which the body was part of, as well as spiritual reality, the reality of the pure forms and ideals that only the mind or soul could really be at one with. In Platonic philosophy, later, which became Neoplatonism throughout the Middle Ages, these two realms, one physical and one spiritual, became the foundation of Christian theology mixed with philosophy. In the philosophy of Aquinas, and we see the immortal soul as the essential self that lives on, as opposed to the transitory physical world of the body. For Aristotle, it was a little different because he didn't see it as two separate worlds, but the anima, or the soul, that which animated the body, the living principle of the body. So Aristotle had a more materialistic concept. When we turn to Descartes, the father of modern philosophy, we are left with his method of doubt, systematic doubt. When Descartes doubted the senses and even doubted the truth of mathematical and logical formulas, he was left with one thing he could no longer doubt, and that was his famous cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. So the human mind, the thinking process, becomes the center of identity and selfhood in modern philosophy. But Cartesian philosophy gives us another legacy, the mind and the body, which are separate yet interact somewhere. Descartes came up with the idea of a pineal gland, perhaps, where the mind and body interact. But Descartes begins selfhood and the idea of knowledge in the human mind, which is rationalism. The rationalists, Plato through Descartes, really see reason as the basis of selfhood, as well as knowledge. So when we look at epistemology, the study of knowledge in philosophy, we get the rationalists, but then a split, a new school emerges called the empiricists. The empiricists see the basis of knowledge in sense data, in our sensory perceptions of the outside world. For example, John Locke saw the mind as a blank slate, a tabula rasa, and the sensory data of experience gives us the source, the entire source of knowledge. So where is the self? The self to Locke is the memory that links my sense data today with my sense data yesterday and tomorrow. So someone without memory, perhaps somebody with Alzheimer's that loses their sense of selfhood. Hume was another empiricist that further took Locke to new realms of skepticism. When Hume went to look for the self, all he could find were fleeting perceptions. In fact, Hume saw the mind as simply a bundle of perception, like a movie theater. When looking for a separate entity, such as the self, Hume said it doesn't exist, or it exists only as a fiction. Kant realized that Hume's objection to the permanent self and empiricism presented a real problem for philosophy. In fact, Kant said Hume awoke him from his dogmatic slumber. And to address philosophy, Kant, in his critique of pure reason, started with Hume's idea and Locke's idea that all knowledge begins in sense data of the outside world. However, when the mind processes the sense data of the outside world, there are certain things the mind does within its own structure that transforms sense data into the experiences that we know. The categories, structures of reason itself add such ideas as space and time, causality, cause-effect, And so we get a unified picture of reality because the mind, or human reason, is a very dynamic process by which we construct reality. While Kant synthesized both the empiricist and the rationalist in a new unified version of human consciousness, others that followed, the centuries that followed, take the mind, the science of the mind, to new dimensions. Take Sigmund Freud, for instance, in the 19th century, realized that there are many subconscious and irrational drives that motivate the self and form our idea of selfhood. In fact, when realizing all the subconscious drives and urges in Freudian psychology, we have a multi-layered version of the self. Further empirical studies of the self today regard the mind as a physical process of the brain. In fact, scientific-minded philosophers known as eliminative materialists really try to reduce all of mental processes to brain processes. In the emerging science of neurobiology, we're learning more and more about how the brain really operates and functions. And this knowledge of brain science, as it unfolds, will surely replace many of the old metaphysical notions and metaphors for human selfhood. In contrast to this empirical bent of modern philosophers and eliminative materialists who see brain research as the way of the future, there's an existential school, also called phenomenologists, who really reject this scientific objectification of the brain. After all, the human self, we always inhabit bodies in a lived world. So phenomenology focuses on the direct and subjective experiences of a living self in a living world with others. According to the philosopher Merleau-Ponty, the self is embodied subjectivity. According to another 20th century philosopher, Gilbert Ryle, when we look closely into mental functions and mental phenomena, we really can't see other minds. All we can see is resulting behavior. So upon empirical examination, we really can only see other selves as they behave, which has opened a whole new behaviorist approach to psychology as well as philosophy, which ties in empirical observation of observable behavior is the only way of really distinguishing selfhood or the nature of oneself. Concepts of consciousness and identity we see vary with philosophers, vary with time, and vary with cultures. In many non-Western cultures, the idea of self can only be measured and understood in relation to others, in relation to a whole community, which is by and large interconnected. In the Buddhist concept of anatta, there is no self. In fact, the self is part of the problem. It's an illusion. Because we have sensations, as Hume said, we're led to the false assumption that the ego is permanent, enduring, and impermeable, will last forever. Whereas the notion of reality is constantly changing, transitory, and no substance is permanent, such as a mind. This notion of the ego is an illusion in Buddhism, and part of our problems because we desire to have things and hold on to things, which becomes a source of suffering and pain. In Buddhist enlightenment, letting go of oneself is actually the very beginning of enlightenment, and realizing that we're all interconnected in a chain of being and living, dying, and reincarnation. So in summary, we have a variety of views, philosophical views on the selfhood. The immortal soul, the self is the immortal soul, according to Plato, Socrates, Augustine. The mind, the thinking thing, according to Descartes. The self as sensory experience, according to Locke. The self is nothing but a bundle of changing impressions, according to Hume. And then the self as a unified consciousness embodied in reason, according to Kant. The self is nothing but the brain, according to Paul Churchland and other eliminative materialists. Or the self as a multi-layered entity of both conscious and subconscious drives, according to Freud. Or the self as embodied subjectivity, according to Merleau-Ponty. Or simply the self as observable behavior, according to Gilbert Ryle. And then finally, non-Western concepts of the self, which are interconnected with community, and in the case of Buddhism, the self as a fictitious illusion, something to be let go of in the process of enlightenment. So enjoy as you research and study and discover the variety of philosophical approaches to the nature of selfhood. And through this process, hopefully we will know ourselves a little better.